Minnesota Insight. I'm your host, Jason Trimble, and today our guest is Max Korn, a director of community impact for the Minneapolis Foundation. Thank you for being here, Max.
Hey, you bet.
So education is a big issue in Minnesota and across the country. What would you say is the mission of the Minneapolis Foundation and what they're doing to help the situation?
Sure. The mission of the Minneapolis Foundation is to enlarge the culture of generosity across the city of Minneapolis, and specifically in education to increase equity for students of color and low socioeconomic status across the city to make sure that they have similar outcomes to their higher income and white peers.
Great. And what would you say that the biggest problem in the education system is in Minnesota?
I think there are a number of complicated factors that contribute to the large opportunity gap that we have in Minnesota and largely across the country. One thing that we really emphasize at the Minneapolis Foundation is that we know national models of schools and charter school networks, as well as district schools, that are getting really great results closing those gaps have a large site-based control, meaning that their principals have greater control over the teachers that they hire and the way that the funding is used at their school. So something that we're increasingly concerned with is finding our schools and our school leaders that are able to exercise that type of autonomy over their human capital and their budgets.
Great. So if they have more control directly after their funding and their teaching techniques, then it seems like there's more success there.
Consistently across the country in the cities that we see the most success, like New Orleans or Denver, at closing those opportunity gaps, one of those key features that's consistent across all of those areas is more site-based control at the school level.
Great. And it's no secret that some certain districts seem to be not performing quite as well as others. Why does the lack of high-quality seats in these districts in these schools seem to be concentrated in these specific areas?
Again, I think those are complicated historical and social reasons that contribute to that. We know that in the city of Minneapolis, our worst performing schools in terms of student outcomes are highly concentrated in North Minneapolis and Southeast Minneapolis, which are two areas that are very high minority population, high immigrant population. And to speak to that is, again, a complicated kind of social web of factors, but we know obviously that our nation has a history of segregation, and that our employment opportunities and our employment outcomes are not similar for people of color and families of color. They're not similar to those outcomes that we have among unemployment, lower numbers of unemployment for white families, middle class and upper class families. So there's a correlation there.
Okay. Does the Minneapolis Foundation target those areas with funding or with other charities or anything like that?
Absolutely. So like I said, our mission is primarily to support organizations that are having a large impact on closing gaps in equity. And so what we end up doing by default then is supporting organizations. The majority of the organizations that we make charitable grants to are working in those areas. So it's not necessarily that we're targeting those geographic areas, but we're targeting and supporting organizations that are reaching out to those populations.
Okay. What can private citizens or just the public in general do to aid in this fight to kind of close the gap between the problem areas and maybe the areas that are probably doing really well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the most critical thing that people across the city, but particularly young people, can do is to get really involved in and become civically engaged, to make sure that they're voting in elections, following issues, contacting their state representatives, and demanding that legislative action be taken to put in place policies that will ease local control to close those gaps, as well as paying attention to things like your local school board races, neighborhood commissions, and things like that.
Sure, just getting directly involved with the school at that level.
Absolutely.
As well as making policy changes as well.
And at schools like the University of Minnesota, there are also student organizations that have been really highly effective in closing the opportunity gap, such as Students for Education Reform. So look into your local chapter as well.
Well, great. Well, thank you for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
This has been Minnesota Insight. Thank you for joining us. Good night.